Chapter 1. A Knight's Vow. The storm had chased Sir Julien across the Bretonnian plains, rolling in like a herald of doom. His destrier, Beaufort, galloped tirelessly through the murk of a moonless night, carrying him toward his destination, the ruined fortress of Château L'Obscur. The castle loomed against the horizon, its jagged silhouette broken like the spine of some ancient. Julien reined in his horse as he approached the outer walls. The once proud fortress was now little more than a husk. The banners of House de Montfort had long since rotted away, leaving only shattered towers and ivy-choked stone. But it was not the ruin that chilled his blood. It was the unnatural silence. No insects hummed. No wolves howled. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. A lone figure emerged from the keep's gaping entrance, a man wrapped in a threadbare cloak, his gaunt face illuminated by a sputtering lantern. The noble who had summoned him, Lord Reynard de Montfort, was a shadow of his former self. His once proud lineage was evident in his bearing, but there was a madness in his eyes, a haunted look that spoke of many sleepless nights. "Dear knight, you came." Reynard's voice was a rasp, raw from whispered prayers or silent screams. "The lady blesses you, for you are our last hope." Julien dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet earth. "Speak plainly, my lord. What horror plagues these lands?" Reynard beckoned him inside. The great hall was stripped bare, the long banquet tables overturned, and the tapestries slashed as though by bestial claws. A single candle flickered upon a battered table, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. "It began months ago beneath the castle," Reynard murmured, pouring himself a goblet of wine with trembling hands. "The tunnels, the old catacombs, were never meant to be disturbed, but my ancestors built atop something ancient, something cursed. The peasants whispered of rat men, but I thought them fools, until the disappearances began." Julien's hazel eyes narrowed. He had heard tales of the Skaven, the verminous creatures that lurked beneath the world, but few in Bretonnia gave credence to such legends. A knight's duty was to slay dragons, to battle chaos warriors, not to chase after peasant superstitions. "It is no mere rat-man that haunts these halls," Reynard continued, voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have seen it, Sir Julien. It walks on two legs, but it is no man, no beast, no thing born of the lady's grace. It is an abomination." Julien's fingers curled around the hilt of his longsword, the sword of Calmont, its weight a familiar comfort. "A mutant?" he asked. Reynard flinched at the word. "Worse." He rose, leading Julien to a stone staircase that spiraled downward into the depths of the keep. Each step groaned underfoot, as if resenting their intrusion. At the bottom lay a great iron door, its surface warped and blackened, as though touched by some unholy force. The markings of old Bretonnian wards were etched into the frame, but they had been clawed through. Defiled beyond recognition, Julien stepped closer. The air reeked of rot and something fouler, a musk of corruption, of chaos. "The beast resides beyond this door," Reynard whispered. "It feasts in the dark. No blade has touched it, no fire has burned it. It mocks the lady's will." Julien exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had fought brigands, greenskins, even chaos marauders, but this was different. Something deeper stirred here, something ancient and foul. But he was Sir Julien of House Calmont. He was a questing knight, sworn to the lady's service. To falter was to shame his lineage. To fear was to betray his vow. He turned to Reynard, his expression steeled with resolve. "I will slay this abomination, my lord. By the lady's grace, I swear it." Reynard said nothing, only watched as Julien placed a gauntleted hand on the iron door, ready to descend into the abyss. Chapter 2. The Shadow Below. The chapel within Château L'Obscur was little more than a crumbling ruin, its once proud stained glass shattered, its altar draped in cobwebs. Flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows against the cold stone walls as Father Aurelian knelt in prayer. Julien stood near the entrance, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword, watching the old priest with measured patience. Aurelian was a gaunt man, his beard streaked with gray, his robes tattered from years of hardship. His eyes, however, burned with conviction. "You should not go," said Julien, Aurelia murmured without looking up. "The lady has abandoned this place. No holy blessing lingers here, only damnation." Julien strode forward, the steel of his sabatons ringing against the stone floor. "That is all the more reason I must go. The lady's light does not turn away from her people, Father. She tests us. I will not fail her." The priest exhaled a tired sigh. "Faith is a fragile thing, my son. If you go down there, you may never return. Or worse, you may return changed." Julien knelt before the altar, bowing his head. His fingers traced the silver chalice sigil upon his cloak's clasp, a silent prayer forming in his heart. "Lady of the lake, guide my blade. Let me be your will. Let me be worthy." The silence stretched between them before Aurelian finally spoke. "You are young, brave, perhaps even blessed, but be warned. There are things in the dark that know no fear of chivalry. The Skaven are not men. They do not think like men. They are cunning, cruel, and cowardly. And their god," he shuddered, "their god is listening." Julien rose, his expression hardening. "Then let him hear my challenge." He turned, stepping into the shadows beyond the chapel. Father Aurelian did not follow. The labyrinth beckons. The entrance to the catacombs lay beneath the ruined keep, hidden beyond a rotting wooden staircase that spiraled downward. Moisture dripped from the stone walls, carrying the scent of decay and stagnant air. The deeper he went, the colder it became, as if the light of the world above had no dominion here. At last he reached the sealed doorway, or rather, what should have been sealed. The ancient Bretonnian wards, carved into the iron gate, had been defiled. Symbols of the lady's blessing were scratched through, their power extinguished by some malignant force. The gate itself was ajar, revealing a gaping maw of darkness beyond. Julien's jaw tightened. So this is how it began. Something had broken free from below, or something had let it out. He unsheathed his sword, the sword of Calmont, its steel glinting in the dim torchlight. His kite shield, bearing the silver falcon of his house, rested firm in his left hand. He took a breath and stepped inside. The descent into the moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The silence was suffocating, but within it he heard things. The scuttling of unseen feet, the chitter of something just beyond his vision, the faint scrape of claws against stone. His boots disturbed thick dust, untouched for decades, until recently. Julien followed the tracks, faint but unmistakable, three-toed, clawed feet, some small, some disturbingly large. A shiver crawled down his spine. The Skaven were real. His father had dismissed them as superstition, as did most Bretonnian lords. Rats the size of men? A peasant's tale. But the truth lay before him, scratched into the very walls. Skaven runes, crude and erratic, carved with panicked urgency. He touched one. The stone felt wrong, slick with an oily residue. Chaos taint. Julien whispered a curse under his breath. Then, ahead in the tunnel, a faint glow. He approached cautiously, every step careful. The glow emanated from a pile of strange green stones stacked haphazardly against the wall. The very air around them seemed to hiss and hum. "Arpstone," he muttered. Even to speak the name felt unholy. He had heard of it in whispered legends, the cursed mineral that fueled dark magic, the very lifeblood of the Skaven. A new sound, a low, wet scraping. Julien's head snapped toward the noise. His grip tightened on his sword as he saw the blood-stained drag marks leading deeper into the tunnels. Something had been taken. or something had been fed. A shadow shifted. Julien whirled around, sword raised. Nothing. He exhaled, forcing his pulse to steady. The darkness played tricks on the mind. But the warning of Father Aurelian rang in his thoughts. If you go down there, you may never return, or worse, you may return changed. Julien pressed onwards. The deeper he ventured, the stronger the stench of rot and corruption became. The tunnels twisted in unnatural ways, the architecture shifting between Bretonnian stonework and Skaven burrows, evidence that this warren had long been a battle between two worlds. Then he heard it, a guttural breathing just beyond the next bend. Something big. Julien stilled, positioning his shield. His heart pounded, but his will held strong. With only his sword, his shield, and his faith, he stepped forward. Chapter 3. Echoes of Skaven. The air within the tunnel was thick, damp, and heavy with the stench of rot and old blood. Sir Julien moved cautiously, his torch held high, casting wavering shadows across the stone walls. The flickering light revealed remnants of something terrible, not just old ruins, but the unmistakable mark of something unnatural. As he advanced, his hazel eyes scanned the surroundings. The architecture of these tunnels shifted in unsettling ways. One moment, he strode through the time-worn remnants of a Bretonnian stronghold. The next, the walls narrowed into crude burrows carved with erratic, inhuman precision. The transition was seamless, as if the two structures had fused over centuries of occupation. This place had once been his ancestors', but now it belonged to something else. The first signs, Julien's boots crunched against scattered debris. At first he thought them to be simple rubble, but as he knelt, realization struck him with a sickening weight. Bones, not just animal remains, but human ones. Some shattered, others gnawed to the marrow. The markings upon them were unmistakable, bite marks, jagged and crude. The Skaven had been here. Yet, or still were. Julien rose swiftly, gripping his sword tighter. His breath came slower, measured. He was being watched. He could feel it, though he saw nothing. He moved forward, passing beneath a crumbling archway where the walls were covered in strange glyphs. Not Bretonnian, not imperial. They were Skaven markings, chaotic, crude, scrawled with clawed fingers dipped in filth and blood. Julien touched one cautiously. The surface was sticky, fresh. Something had marked these walls recently. His stomach twisted. He had been told all his life that the Skaven were myths, the delusions of frightened peasants. Yet here, in the damp, suffocating dark, he knew the truth. And the truth was, watching him, the whispering dark. A sound echoed through the tunnels. Not from behind, not ahead. Everywhere. A chittering, high-pitched and rapid, like rats scratching beneath floorboards. But there was something unnatural about it. It was speech. Julien could not understand the words, but the intent was clear. Laughter. Not the laughter of men, but the mocking, rasping hiss of something that knew he did not belong here. Julien took a steadying breath and pressed forward. His torch burned low, but the heat of battle still pulsed in his blood. He would not turn back. He would not be afraid. The shrine of the Ratman. Further in, the tunnel widened into a chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. The stench of decay was overwhelming here, and at the center lay a stone altar, its surface slick with something black. Julien stepped forward, his torchlight illuminating the grotesque display. A human skull, impaled upon an iron spike, sat atop the altar. Around it, twisted effigies fashioned from bone and sinew were arranged in chaotic patterns, symbols of a faith not meant for human minds. But what made his blood run cold was the carving upon the stone. A symbol he had seen once before in an ancient tome, a crude yet unmistakable depiction of the horned rat. Chaos. Julien felt a sickness rise in his gut. This was not just a warren of vermin, it was a temple, a shrine to something dark, something living in the spaces between worlds. The whispers grew louder. He spun, blade raised. The darkness was no longer empty. Eyes, hundreds of them, reflecting his torchlight, blinking in the gloom. The chittering turned into laughter. Julien tightened his grip. The Skaven were real, and now they were here. Chapter 4. First Blood. The glowing eyes in the darkness did not blink. They did not waver. They only watched. Julien stood his ground, the sword of Calmont gleaming in the flickering torchlight. His shield was raised, its battered surface reflecting the eerie green glow of the Skaven shrine. Then, movement. The chittering crescendoed into a frenzy as the creatures surged forward. The Skaven were no longer watching. They were attacking. The first clash. The first clanrad lunged from the shadows, its matted fur reeking of filth, its jagged dagger slick with green poison. Julien twisted, parrying the strike with a swift arc of his longsword. The blade struck true, slicing into the creature's exposed side. It squealed, stumbling back with a spurt of blackened blood. But before it could collapse, two more leapt forward. Julien blocked the first strike with his shield, but the second ratman was fast, too fast. Its blade scraped against his breastplate, sending sparks flying. He pivoted, driving his boot into the creature's chest, sending it sprawling. The third clanrat did not hesitate. It came from Julien's blind spot, its beady red eyes glinting with malice. Julien barely turned in time. The poisoned blade nicked his shoulder. A sharp sting, then a burning sensation as the venom bit into his flesh. He gritted his teeth, no time to think, no time to feel pain. With a defiant roar, Julien lashed out. His blade cut deep, severing the ratman's arm at the elbow. It shrieked, writhing as it collapsed into the dirt. The others hesitated. Fear. Julien pressed the advantage. The reckoning. With one decisive stroke, he cleaved the next Skaven from shoulder to hip, its blackened blood sizzling where it touched the cold stone. Another tried to retreat, a fatal mistake. Julien lunged, driving his blade into the base of its skull. The creature convulsed before collapsing into a twitching heap. Then, silence. Julien stood among the slain, his chest heaving. His armor was slick with filth and blood. His shield bore new scratches. His sword dripped with the corruption of this place. His shoulder throbbed where the poisoned blade had struck him. The wound burned, but it was not deep. He could endure. But the battle was not the true horror. It was what came after. The chittering had stopped. A realization curled in his stomach like ice. The Skaven had tested him. They had not attacked in full force. They had watched. They had learned. He was not hunting them. He was in their domain. And now they knew exactly what they were dealing with. The shadows shifted. The tunnels whispered. The hunt had truly begun. Chapter 5. The Labyrinth's Curse. The tunnels should have been simple to navigate. Julien had memorized the structure of Château L'Obscur before descending. Old Bretonian catacombs repurposed by invaders, a labyrinth of stone and filth beneath the ruins. And yet, the deeper he went, the more the passageways shifted, betraying any sense of direction. Walls that had once stood firm now opened into unexpected corridors. Passages he had walked before were now sealed by debris that had not been there moments ago. This was no natural ward. Something, or someone, was twisting the very foundations of the world down here. The path that wasn't there. Julien exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on his sword. He was not afraid. No knight of Bretonnia would fear the dark, nor the tricks of Vermin. And yet, the air itself seemed wrong. The moment he stepped forward, he could feel something watching, not with eyes, but with presence. And then the whispers began. At first, they were indistinct. A trick of the wind, the echo of his own boots against the damp stone. But then they took shape. The visions began. A torch flickered, its shadows twisting against the walls. In them, figures moved. Julien's breath hitched. A knight in tattered armor, his surcoat stained with filth and failure, knelt upon the cold stone. His shield, a falcon just like Julien's own, was broken in half. Julien stepped closer, his own shadow stretching unnaturally as he neared. The knight raised his head, and Julie knew him. Vermin. The figure's face was gaunt, his hazel eyes hollow. His father, Sir Edward de Calmont, the legendary knight who had fought against the Chaos incursions, looked upon him with an expression Julien had never seen before. Despair. "You are not worthy," Edward whispered. Julien's stomach turned to ice. "What?" His father did not answer. His mouth twisted, as if struggling to speak, but no words came. Instead, he crumbled. Not into dust, not into stone, but into rats. A swarm of them, pouring from his armor, flooding from his mouth, spilling across the floor in a writhing mass. Julien staggered back, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The swarm rushed toward him. He swung his sword. The blade met only emptiness. And then the vision was gone. The lady's judgment. Julien braced himself against the stone wall, his breath ragged. That was not real. It could not be real, but it had felt real. His father had died honorably. He had been a paragon of virtue, a defender of Bretonnia. Hadn't he? Julien clenched his jaw. He had heard the rumors. That his father had failed. That his father had faltered in his quest for the grail. That he had died a man, not a legend. Julien had never believed it. But now, in the depths of this cursed warren, the doubt slithered into his mind like a serpent. And then, the whispers changed. A woman's voice, cold, distant, and sorrowful. "You are not worthy, Sir Julien." His blood ran cold. No. The torchlight flickered. Before him, the stone wall melted away, revealing a mirror of water. And in it, the Lady of the Lake, or at least the image of her. Her veil was torn, her robes were stained, her radiance was gone. She looked upon him with indifference, and then she turned away. The water rippled, and then it was gone. Julien stood alone in the dark. His faith had never wavered before. But now, beneath the ruin of Château L'Obscur, where the walls twisted and the whispers mocked him, it was wavering. The hunt continues. Julien swallowed the doubt, forcing his mind to steady. He was not weak. He would not falter. With a sharp inhale, he pressed forward. The Skaven were close. The hunt was not yet over. But something in the dark smiled. It had seen his weakness, and it would use it. Chapter 6. The Rat King's Deception. The tunnels stretched endlessly, twisting in directions that made no sense. Julien had long since lost any certainty of his path. The air was thick with decay, the walls damp with filth. His torch sputtered, its flame struggling against the oppressive darkness. And then, a voice. Lost, yes. Julien froze, his sword instinctively rising. The voice was smooth, oily, unnaturally fluent in Bretonian, yet layered with a chittering undertone. From the gloom ahead, a shape emerged. Tall, cloaked, hunched. A Skaven, but not like the others. This one was garbed in ragged purple robes adorned with trinkets of bone and warped metal. Long, spindly claws clutched a gnarled staff, its headpiece a rusted bell inscribed with blasphemous runes. His eyes gleamed, reflecting Julien's torchlight. Green. Malicious. Too intelligent. Julien knew what he was seeing. A Grey Seer. A sorcerer of the Skaven, and one that spoke his tongue. Julien's grip tightened on his sword. "You are Skryrik, aren't you?" The Skaven's snout twitched, his fanged mouth curling into something resembling a grin. "Yes," Yes, Night Thing knows my name. Clever, smart, but foolish. So foolish, foolish to come here. Yes, yes. Scrithrick's voice was mocking, yet laced with an unsettling amusement. Julien raised his shield. I have no patience for your tricks, vermin. I seek the beast. Stand aside or die. Scrithrick chuckled, a deep, grating sound. Brave Paul Knight. So sure. So certain. The Grey Seer took a slow step forward, his claws clicking against the stone. But lost, yes, yes. Trapped, surrounded. My tunnels, my domain. No escape. No way but down, down. Julien's eyes flicked to the shadows beyond Scrithrick. He could sense them, the skein, lurking, watching. A trap. Of course it was a trap. And yet Scrithrick did not attack. Instead he tilted his head, studying Julien. Night Thing wants the beast. Wants to slay, yes, yes. His long claws traced sigils in the air, faint green warp light crackling at his fingertips. But Beast Thing is far. Deep, deep, hidden below, beyond Night Thing's reach. His eyes gleamed. I can show you the way. A shortcut, yes, yes. A test of faith or folly. Julien hesitated. The very idea of trusting a Skaven, let alone a Grey Seer, was insanity. And yet, the tunnels had been shifting against him, guiding him in circles. The longer he remained lost, the greater the risk. And Scrithrick knew it. The sorcerer grinned wider. Yes, yes, think. Night Thing is clever, yes, knows he cannot win without help. Julien steeled himself. Why? Scrithrick's ears twitched. Can we help? Yes, good question. Maybe I hate the beast, maybe I despise it, yes? Maybe I serve a great master who does not want beast to live. Live. Julien stared into the Grey Seer's sickly green eyes. He was lying. But was the lie the trap, or the truth? Julien could cut him down now. But the beast was close, and he could not afford to waste time. Would he take the risk? The path forward. Scrithrick stretched a long, clawed finger to his right, where the tunnel split. The main path was wide, damp, and reeking of rot. It descended slowly, a winding trail of unknown horrors. But the smaller passage, the one Scrithrick now pointed at, was unnatural. A narrow archway, barely wide enough for a man, where the stone walls were smoother, almost polished. The air within it was still. Wrong. Scrithrick clicked his teeth. The long way is death dash. My way is safe. Julien's knuckles turned white around his sword hilt. The lady's light was faint down here. He could not hear her voice, could not feel her presence, only the cold, watching dark, and the waiting eyes of the Skaven. A test of faith or folly? Julien exhaled and stepped forward. Chapter 7. A Knight's Doubt. The tunnel narrowed, the walls smooth and damp, slick with some unholy residue that clung to Julien's armor as he passed. The stench of rot and sulfur thickened, turning each breath into a struggle. The air was too still, the silence oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Scrithrick had disappeared. Whether by trickery or design, the Grey Seer had left him alone. The only way forward was through the path Scrithrick had shown him. And it led to something terribly wrong. The defiled shrine. The passage opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost to darkness. Columns of ancient Bretonnian stone stood like sentinels, but their surfaces were twisted, scarred by unnatural carvings. At the center of the room stood an altar. It had once been a shrine to the Lady of the Lake, a place of prayer and reverence. He recognized the old Bretonnian craftsmanship, the delicate carvings of knights supplicant before their goddess. But now it was defiled. Chaos runes, jagged and cruel, had been carved over the sacred imagery. Dark symbols pulsated with sickly red and green light, shifting when he tried to focus on them. The chalice of the lady, once an emblem of divine purity, had been split in two. The pieces lay discarded, half buried in filth. Blood painted the altar, dried in some places, fresh in others. Bones, human, unmistakably human, were scattered at its base. Julien's breath caught in his throat. This was not just a Skaven nest. Something far worse had taken root here. His hand trembled as he reached for the broken chalice. As his fingers touched the cold, ruined metal, a voice whispered from the shadows. The warning of the dead. It was not the Skaven's voice, not the mutant's, not even his own thoughts. It was his father's. "Turn back, Julien, or you will fall as I did." Julien's blood turned to ice. He whirled, sword raised, scanning the shadows. Nothing. Just the sickly glow of the chaos runes. But the whisper had been real. He had heard, "You are not worthy." The words pressed into his mind like a dagger. He had faced fear before. He had fought monsters, seen battle, endured the trials of knighthood. But this was not a battle of steel and flesh. It was a battle of faith, and the shadows knew his weakness. The horror unveiled. He forced himself to breathe, to steady his shaking hands. If his father had fallen, then he would stand. He turned from the altar, forcing his feet forward. As he moved past the shrine, the tunnel ahead shifted, warped, like a living thing. And then he saw it. A mural carved into the stone, so ancient and blasphemous it sent a chill through his bones. It depicted the mutant. No, not a mutant, a horror. The beast was not a mere abomination of Skaven filth. It was a thing of chaos, twisted into existence not by chance, but by design. A creation of sorcery, of ritual, of sacrifice. It was not born. It was made. A champion of some dark god. A thing that had once been human. Julien's pulse thundered in his ears. This was not just a test of his skill. It was a test of his soul. And suddenly he was no longer certain if he could pass it. The whisper came again. Turn back. And this time he almost believed it. Chapter 8. The Vermin tide awakens. The whispers stopped. The moment Julien stepped away from the desecrated shrine, the air around him changed. It became thicker, charged with unseen malice. He had lingered too long. Something had been watching him. Something had been waiting. And now it struck. The ambush. The first Skaven attack came from above. Julien barely had time to react before a clawed figure dropped from the ceiling, its dagger flashing toward his throat. He twisted, bringing up his shield just in time to deflect the strike. The impact rattled his arm, sending him stumbling backward. More movement. Skaven poured from the walls, the tunnels, the shadows themselves. They did not charge recklessly this time. No, they had learned. They surrounded him, moving with a terrible intelligence, their beady red eyes glowing in the dark. A single Skaven chieftain stepped forward, clad in piecemeal armor, its rusted sword slick with venom. It raised its blade. And they swarmed. The desperate battle. Julien fought with everything he had. His sword flashed, severing limbs and slicing through ratmen flesh. Each strike was precise, disciplined, but the Skaven did not falter. For every one he cut down, two more took its place. A dagger sliced across his thigh. He kicked his attacker away, but another Skaven clawed at his back, raking against his armor. He turned. Too slow. A rusted blade found its mark, slicing through the weakened joints of his armor and biting into his side. Julien roared in pain, but did not fall. He drove his shield forward, crushing the skull of the ratman who had struck him. But he was tiring. His movement slowed. The weight of his injuries, the exhaustion, the endless tide of vermin, they were going to overwhelm him. The chieftain saw its opening. It lunged. Jean raised his sword, but too late. The ratman's blade sliced down and stopped. A dagger buried itself in the Skaven's throat, its edge gleaming even in the darkness. The chieftain gurgled, its red eyes flickering in confusion before collapsing. Julien staggered back, panting, bloodied. His rescuer stepped forward. A hooded figure, slim and poised, stood amidst the carnage. Twin daggers gleamed in her hands, her stance relaxed, yet ready. She turned to him, her face hidden beneath the shadow of her hood. "You looked like you needed help, knight." Her voice was low, smooth, edged with amusement. Julien narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The woman grinned, twirling one of her daggers. "Marianne, and I hate rats." Chapter 9. A Sinister Pact. The Skaven corpses lay scattered at Julien's feet, their blackened blood oozing into the stone floor. His breath was heavy, his muscles burning from exhaustion, but his grip on the sword of Calmont did not falter. Across from him, the hooded woman, Marianne, wiped the blood from her daggers, her movements quick, precise, practiced. Julien studied her in the dim torchlight. She was no common rogue. Her stance was too steady, her hands too sure. "You fight well for a thief," he muttered, catching his breath. Marianne let out a soft chuckle, her hood shifting just enough to reveal a sharp smirk. "And you fight well for a knight." Julien frowned, but before he could press her, she spoke again. "You don't even know what you're chasing, do you?" she asked, sheathing her daggers. Her tone was unreadable, somewhere between curiosity and disappointment. Julien's expression hardened. "I know enough. A mutant beast lurks below. It must be slain. That is my duty." Marianne tilted her head. "A beast? A mutant? Is that what they told you?" Julien clenched his jaw. "Explain yourself, now." She sighed, as if speaking to a child. "It's not just some twisted horror born of the wilds, knight. It's something far worse." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. It was made. Julien's fingers curled around the hilt of his sword. "What?" Marianne nodded toward the tunnel ahead. "By Clan Moulder." The name sent a chill down Julien's spine. The Skaven of Hellpit. The fleshcrafters, the makers of unspeakable horrors. Marianne's expression turned grim. "It wasn't born that way. It was taken. A Bretonnian knight, maybe even one of your own, twisted, broken, and reforged into something unnatural." Julien felt his stomach turn. "A knight, a man, turned into a beast." "You're lying." His voice was low, but there was no conviction in it. Marianne shook her head. "I wish I was, but I've seen it. I've heard its screams." Her eyes flickered toward the darkness ahead. "It's still in there, and it's still suffering. The Seer's plan." Julien's mind swirled with the implications. Night, captured and twisted into something inhuman. This was no mere hunt. It was a violation, a sin against the lady's will. He took a steadying breath. "If it is true, then I will end its suffering. The lady's mercy demands it." Marianne, however, did not look reassured. "It's not that simple." Julien turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" Marianne crossed her arms. "The Grey Seer isn't finished with it." The air around them seemed colder. Julien narrowed his eyes. "Critique." Marianne nodded. "He's preparing something. He wants to take what Clan Moulder started and improve it, make it something more." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "Wants to assault." Julien felt his breath hitch. That was not possible. The Skaven were creatures of ruin. Their magic was filth and madness. But if they were trying to bind something deeper, something darker... Julien's blood ran cold. "Chaos." Marianne nodded grimly. "A vessel for something worse, something ancient." Julien's hands tightened into fists. The seer was no longer simply guarding a monster. He was making one, and if he succeeded, the world itself could suffer. A knight's choice. Julien exhaled. His faith still wavered, but his purpose did not. Whatever the Skaven were planning, he would put an end to it. "Then we'll go." His voice was firm. Marianne studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "All right, knight. Let's see if your sword is as strong as your conviction." She turned, disappearing into the shadows ahead. Julien followed, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Chapter 10. The Test of Faith. The tunnels narrowed into an oppressive chokehold of stone and filth. The further they went, the stronger the stench of rot and corruption became. Julien could feel it, the weight of something unnatural pressing down on them. The Skaven were close. The abomination was closer. And yet something new emerged in the still air. Not the chittering whispers of the Skaven. Not the warped echoes of chaos. But voices. Human voices. And they were screaming. The prisoners. Marianne froze, her sharp eyes flicking to Julien. "That's not the beast." Julien's grip tightened on his sword. He already knew. "Prisoners." He took a step forward, but Marianne grabbed his arm. Julien turned to her, his hazel eyes burning with righteous fury. "They need help." Marianne scowled, shaking her head. "It's a trap." Julien didn't care. "Then I'll spring it." He broke into a run. The cage of flesh. The tunnel widened, revealing a ghastly sight. A rusted iron cage, large enough to hold dozens of people, sat in the center of a foul chamber. Its bars were slick with filth, the ground beneath it soaked in blood and waste. Inside, villagers, men, women, and children, huddled together, their eyes hollow, their bodies reduced to skin and bone. Julien's stomach turned. These were peasants of Bretonnia, the people he had sworn to protect, left here to rot, to be devoured, or worse. One of them, a young boy, caught sight of him and reached through the bars. "Sir Knight, please, help us." Julien rushed forward. Then, a metallic snap. The floor beneath him shifted. Marianne's warning cry came too late. The cage dropped. Chains rattled. A hidden door slammed open. And the Skaven attacked. The trap. They came from every direction. From the ceiling, from the walls, from the shadows themselves. A wave of chittering, snarling vermin, their eyes gleaming with malice. Julien raised his shield, bracing against the charge. The first ratman lunged, he cut it down. The second slashed at his side, he drove his blade through its throat. A third climbed his back. Marianne's dagger flew, impaling it through the eye. The fight was relentless, and Julien was running out of time. The choice. He could feel it, the tide turning against him. For every Skaven he slew, more came. He was wasting time. The beast still lived. The Grey Seer's ritual still continued. Julien's mind raced. If he freed the prisoners, it would cost him the chance to strike at the heart of this abomination. If he left them, they would die, slowly, painfully. His knightly vows demanded he save them. His warrior's instincts knew that killing the seer mattered more. One would save a few. The other might save all. His hands trembled. The lady had not spoken to him. There was no divine guidance here. Only him, his sword, his choice. A decision in blood. Marianne landed beside him, breathless. "Julien, we don't have time." She saw his face, and she realized he was about to choose. And whatever he chose, it would change him. What will Sir Julien do? A. Free the prisoners, forsaking the hunt for the beast. He will honor his vows no matter the cost. B. Leave them to their fate, striking forward to slay the abomination. He cannot save all, only ensure the horror never reaches the surface. C. Try to do both, risking everything. A reckless gamble, a knight's folly. D. Call upon the lady, demanding her will, but will she answer? Chapter 11. The Monster's Lair. The tunnels narrowed, forcing Julien and Marianne to move in cautious silence. Julien's breath was ragged, his armor slick with Skaven blood. The battle to reach this place had left him wounded but resolute. He could not, would not turn back now. Marianne moved ahead, daggers drawn, her every step precise and deliberate. The path before them descended sharply, spiraling into the deepest part of the warren. And then they saw it. The lair, the chamber of the beast. The tunnel ended at the edge of a massive cavern. A sickly green glow pulsed from warpstone veins embedded in the walls, casting unnatural shadows. The ground was a mix of stone and decayed flesh, pulsing as if the cavern itself was alive. The stench of death and corruption clung to the air. Then came the sounds. Deep, labored breathing. Chains rattling. Something huge shifting in the dark. Julien felt his pulse quicken. The mutant was here, and it was waiting. A monstrous fusion. They moved closer, torches raised. And then, from the gloom, it emerged. The beast was a grotesque fusion of man and Skaven, its form warped and swollen, bound by rusted chains. It stood on two legs, its muscles unnaturally twisted, covered in patches of fur and raw, exposed flesh. One arm was human, though bloated and disfigured, its fingers ending in thick, blackened claws. The other was unmistakably Skaven, a gnarled limb covered in mangy fur, its hand ending in jagged, yellow talons. Its face was a nightmare. Half of it retained the ghost of its Bretonian heritage, the outline of a noble's face, now distorted beyond recognition. The other half was rodent-like, its muzzle elongated, its fangs yellowed, its red eyes burning with madness. And yet, it spoke. A voice, deep, broken, pained. A voice that once belonged to a man. It killed me. Julien stiffened. The beast remembered. A mind torn apart. The mutant staggered forward, its chains clanking against the stone. Julien raised his sword, his instincts screaming at him to strike, but something held him back. This thing, this abomination, was not just a mindless monster. It was suffering. It remembered what it had been. Marianne took a step forward, her daggers ready. "Julien, we have to end this. Now." The beast snarled, its voice shifting between a human's broken whisper and the feral growl of a Skaven. Ome took me, tore me, apart. It clawed at its own flesh, as if trying to rip itself free. I was a knight of Bretonnia. Julien's chest tightened. It had been one of his own. A knight, captured, twisted, defiled. The lady had not saved him. Would she save him now? Or was this thing beyond salvation? The beast lunged forward, its eyes glowing with a chaotic light. "Kill me, knight." Julien's blade flashed. Chapter 12. The Price of Righteousness. Julien stood frozen, his sword raised but unmoving. The mutant knelt before him, its grotesque body shuddering with every breath. It was a monster, twisted, defiled, beyond reason. And yet, it had once been a knight, a man, a servant of the lady. A part of him screamed to strike it down, to end its suffering and cleanse this wretched place with steel and fire. But another part, a deeper, more uncertain voice, whispered something far more dangerous. Could it be saved? The beast looked up at him, its red, Skaven-like eyes flickering. And then it spoke again. "Please, knight, end it, or I will be lost." Julien's breath caught in his throat. And in that moment of doubt, the torches flickered, the air shifted, and the chamber was filled with laughter. The seer returns. A blast of green light erupted from the cavern's entrance, warp fire twisting through the air in sickly tendrils. Julien and Marianne spun toward the source. Skrithrik. The Grey Seer stood atop a pile of bones and rotted corpses, his twisted staff raised high, the runes along its length burning with dark energy. His beady green eyes gleamed, his snout twitching with glee. Yes, yes, doubt waver, night thing, hesitate fail, perfect, perfect. Julien gritted his teeth, lifting his sword once more. Friedrich, this ends now. The Grey Seer chittered, his voice rich with amusement. Oh, yes, yes, it does end, but not how you wish, hope, no, no. His clawed hand shot forward, and the ritual began. The final corruption. The air burned with the scent of sulfur and decay as a shock wave of warp fire surged through the chamber. The mutant shrieked, its massive body convulsing, the chains binding it snapping like brittle twigs. Julien took a step forward, too late. Skrithrick's voice rose in an incantation, the words of the Skaven's dark god pouring from his lips in a horrible, squealing chant. The cavern shuddered. The warpstone veins in the walls flared, pouring their corruption into the creature's body. The mutant, its flesh began to shift, melt, twist. Its Skaven features became more pronounced, its human half burning away in writhing agony. New limbs sprouted, long, jagged claws of bone and chitin. Its torso swelled, its armor breaking apart as spines erupted from its back. Julien watched in horror. The knight that had once been was no more. This was no longer a man, no longer even a Skaven. It was something else, something born of chaos, a knight's failure. Julien's hands shook around his sword hilt. This had been his test, his trial, and he had failed. Had he struck immediately, had he not let his faith falter, had he— No, there was no time for regret. Skrithrick hissed with glee, his tail whipping back and forth as he admired his work. The beast loomed above them now, 3 times the size it had been before, its newly grown tail ending in a barbed, venomous spike. Its eyes, no longer human, no longer Skaven, burned with an unnatural glow. It let out a horrific, distorted roar. Skrithrick turned to Julien. Now, nothing you die, yes, yes. The beast charged. Julien raised his shield. Chapter 13. The Lady's Light. The monstrosity lunged. Its massive claws tore through stone, shattering rock as it charged forward with unholy speed. Julien barely had time to raise his shield before the impact sent him flying. He hit the cavern wall hard, his breath ripped from his lungs. The pain was immediate, sharp, brutal. His ribs screamed in protest. His sword, his family's blade, the sword of Calmont, slipped from his grasp. He collapsed onto the cold, blood-streaked stone, vision swimming. Somewhere, Marianne shouted, her voice lost in the cavern's chaos. The mutant loomed over him, its new form pulsating with raw chaos energy. Skrithrick stood behind it, cackling, triumphant. Yes, yes, fool thing night falls. Useless prayers mean nothing. No lady saves you now. Now! Julien tried to rise, but his body refused. He had nothing left. The edge of defeat. His vision blurred, his limbs felt weak, heavy. Was this how it ended? Not in glory, not in honor, but broken in the depths of a Skaven warren? No, not like this. He had sworn an oath. He had promised to be more than his father's failure. His faith had wavered, but he had never truly abandoned it. And so he prayed, a plea to the lady of the lake. Hear me. I am not worthy. I have faltered, I have doubted, that I will not break. If I am to die here, let it be with honor. Let me die fighting. The mutant raised its claws, preparing the killing strike. Julien closed his eyes. A man, light, a divine presence. It was not fire, not warp fire, not torchlight, but something purer. A soft, radiant glow spread through the cavern, flooding the darkness with warmth. For a brief, impossible moment, everything stilled. The Skaven screeched, their beady eyes blinking furiously as they shielded their faces. Even the mutant recoiled, its feral growl turning into something like fear. And there, Julien saw her, a woman, veiled in silver mist, standing in the glow. She did not speak. She did not move. But Julien felt her presence. It filled him with strength, clarity, purpose. His wounds still burned, his body still ached, but his will no longer wavered. He was not alone. The lady had not abandoned him. Or had she ever been there at all? The will to fight. The vision faded as quickly as it had come. The cavern was dark once more. The mutant's claws still descended. But Julien was already moving. With one final burst of strength, he rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. His hand closed around his sword. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, a surge of certainty filled him. Was it divine grace? Or just his own unyielding will? It didn't matter. Julien rose, and he would not fall again. Chapter 14. Duel of Beasts. The cavern trembled with the weight of something ancient and unnatural. The mutant loomed, its grotesque form pulsating with warp-tainted corruption, its massive frame casting twisted shadows against the cavern walls. Julien tightened his grip on his sword, his body still battered, his wounds still burning. But his resolve had never been stronger. This was not just a fight against the beast before him. It was a battle against his own fears. The battle begins. The mutant roared, its voice a horrible mix of man, beast, and something eldritch. Then it charged. The ground shook beneath its monstrous weight. Julien met it head-on. His blade flashed, striking true, carving into the mutant's side, only for the wound to seal itself instantly, flesh knitting back together in an unnatural display of warp-tainted regeneration. Julien barely had time to react before a massive clawed hand swiped toward him. He raised his shield. Impact. The sheer force of the blow sent him flying, crashing into the cavern wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. But he did not stop moving. Rolling to the side, he barely dodged a second strike, the beast's claws gouging deep trenches into the stone where he had just been. Julien rose to his feet, panting, bloodied. The monster was relentless, and for the first time, a thought whispered in his mind. I can't win. The fear within. Julien had never feared death. Knighthood was a path of sacrifice, and he had accepted that long ago. But this was different. Dying alone, forgotten in the depths of a cursed warren, becoming another lost soul, buried beneath stone, his name fading into obscurity. Or worse, becoming what he fought? He had seen what had become of the knight before him. What if that fate awaited him? A knight twisted into something monstrous, a failure, cursed and forgotten. The doubt slithered through his thoughts like a serpent. But then he heard her voice. Not the mutant's, not Scrithrick's. Rise, my knight. The lady's voice? Or just his own will screaming at him to move? It didn't matter. Julien forced his doubts aside. The fight was not over. The turning point. The mutant lunged again, its claws aiming for Julien's throat. This time, he was ready. Rather than dodge, he stepped forward, shield raised. The moment the claws met steel, Julien twisted, driving his sword deep into the creature's side. The beast howled, staggering. For the first time, it felt pain. Julien pressed the attack. His blade struck again, and again, and... The mutant fought back with fury, but it was slowing. Its flesh still healed, but not as fast. It was weakening. For all its monstrous strength, for all its size and power, it was not invincible. The final strike. The mutant lashed out one last time, its massive hand crashing down. Julien sidestepped, his body screaming in protest, but he had only one focus. His blade. The final blow. He raised his sword high, calling upon every ounce of strength, of faith, of willpower left in him. And then he drove his sword straight through the mutant's chest. The blade pierced deep, cutting through muscle, bone, and whatever dark magic had kept it alive. The creature froze. Its eyes, human and Skaven both, locked onto Julien. For a moment its expression shifted. Not rage, not hatred. Something else. Relief. Then, with a shuddering breath, it collapsed. The cavern fell silent. Julien stood over the fallen monster, blood dripping from his blade. It was over. Victory, or something else. Julien staggered, exhaustion finally overtaking him. His vision blurred. His legs trembled. Had he won? Or had he simply survived? The lady's voice had guided him in that moment. But had it been real? Had he truly been blessed? Or was this victory his alone? As the darkness of unconsciousness crept in, he had no answer, only the certainty that the beast was dead. For now. Chapter 15. The Grey Seer's Gambit. The mutant lay dead, its massive form still, its final breath rattling through the cavern. Julien staggered back, his sword dripping with its darkened blood. His body screamed with exhaustion and pain, but he had done it. It was over, or so he thought. A sharp, high-pitched laugh shattered the silence. No, not over, never over. Julien's blood ran cold. Skrithri. The Grey Seer stood atop the cavern's highest ledge, his staff raised, his eyes burning with warp energy. The Skaven's snout curled into something almost like a grin, his claws twitching with frantic, uncontrolled energy. Stupid, stupid man-thing. You think you win? Think, fool? No. Skrithrik always wins. He slammed his staff into the stone, and the cavern rumbled. And then they came. The Vermin tide. A wave of chittering black fur erupted from the tunnels, hundreds upon hundreds of plague-ridden rats spilling into the cavern. Not just Skaven warriors. These were worse. Swollen, diseased rats, their fur patchy, their eyes glowing with unnatural, sickly green light. Some had fangs too long for their mouths. Others moved in twisted, broken ways, their bodies warped by the unnatural filth of warpstone. The air reeked of rot, decay, and death. And they were coming for him. Julien lifted his shield, preparing for the onslaught, but his body failed him. The wounds, the exhaustion, it was too much. His legs buckled, and in that moment he knew he wouldn't survive this. Not alone. Julien, move! A blur of motion. Then daggers flashed. Marianne's stand. Marianne was a storm of steel and shadow, her daggers slicing through the first wave of plague rats. She spun, ducked, killed again and again. But there were too many. For every rat that fell, 5 more took its place. She turned to Julien, grabbing his arm. We have to run. Now! Julien gritted his teeth. He wanted to fight. He wanted to stand his ground. But he could barely breathe, let alone lift his sword. Marianne yanked him forward. You die here, and this was all for nothing. Move, damn you! Julien forced his shaking legs to obey. He stumbled forward, leaning on Marianne as they made for the tunnel leading out. Behind them, Skrithrik laughed. Run, man-thing, it will not save you. Cave falls, yes, you all die, said Hufu. The collapse begins. The ceiling cracked. Warp energy surged through the cavern, twisting the stone itself. Boulders tumbled from above, crushing Skaven, rats, everything. The very ground shook beneath them. The cavern was falling apart, and Julien was barely conscious. The night's fall. A massive stone slab cracked loose, slamming down directly in their path. Julien tried to move, but his legs failed him. His vision darkened. Marianne turned back, eyes wild. Join, stay with me. Her hand grabbed his, pulling, dragging. But it was too late. The cavern collapsed around them. A final laugh echoed through the dark. Then, silence. Chapter 16. Escape from Damnation. The world was collapsing. The cavern walls shook violently, great fissures splitting through the stone as debris rained from above. Dust and smoke choked the air, filling Julien's lungs with the taste of earth and decay. Somewhere behind him, Skrithrick's laughter faded into the abyss, lost beneath the roaring collapse. The Grey Seer had gotten what he wanted: destruction, chaos, the triumph of ruin. Julien barely had the strength to stand, but he had to move. The last path forward. Marianne was already ahead, scouting a way through the carnage. She turned, her cloak whipping behind her, her voice sharp. "Julien, get up! We're not dying here." Julien gritted his teeth, forcing himself onto shaking legs. His body screamed in protest. His wounds, deep and numerous, bled freely. He had fought beyond his limits, slain an unholy abomination. But there was no glory here, no triumph, only the desperate need to survive. Marianne grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "Come on, knight. You're not quitting on me." The dead and the dying. The Skaven fled in every direction, their cowardice overtaking their bloodlust. Some were crushed beneath the collapsing ceiling, others trampled by their own kin. A few still fought, feral and desperate, but they were no longer an army, just rats caught in the same trap. Julien and Marianne pushed past them, cutting down those who blocked their way. Every step was agony. Every breath was labored. The tunnel ahead split into two paths. Marianne scanned them quickly, then made a decision. "See? Wait." She pointed. Julien nodded weakly, moving as fast as his failing body would allow. And then, a sound. Low, guttural, roar. They both turned. The mutant twitched. It had been dying, torn apart by the final blow. But chaos did not let its servants die so easily. With a horrific, gurgling scream, it lashed out. A final death throw. A clawed hand shot forward. Julien was too slow, but Marianne was faster. She moved without hesitation, shoving Julien aside. The mutant's claw raked across her side, tearing through leather and flesh. She staggered, blood spraying onto the stone. Julien caught himself, turning in horror. "Marianne." She grimaced but didn't fall. Instead, she turned to him, shoving him toward the tunnel. "Oh, keep moving." "We can stay." She cut him off. "Julien, listen to me. If you die here, then this was for nothing. Keep going. Find the exit." Her daggers flashed as she turned back toward the beast. Julien's heart pounded. He could stay. He could fight. But he knew the truth. If he did, they both died. Marianne knew it too. She grinned at him, a reckless, fearless grin. And then she charged. The weight of survival. Julien forced himself forward. He hated himself for it. Hated leaving her behind. But he knew she had made her choice. And if he hesitated, her sacrifice was meaningless. The tunnel closed behind him, the roar of the collapsing cavern swallowing everything. Julien ran. Every step felt like a betrayal. But he ran. He did not know if Marianne was still alive. He did not know if she had even stood a chance. But he could not stop. The surface was near. The world awaited. And Julien was not finished yet. Chapter 17. The Price of Glory. Julien staggered into the night. The ruins of Château L'Obscur loomed before him, bathed in the eerie glow of the fading moonlight. The once great fortress, already a shadow of its former self, now seemed hollow, empty. The weight of the underground horrors clung to him like a second skin. He had survived. But at what cost? The ruined knight. His legs nearly gave out as he crossed the broken threshold, his sword dragging against the dirt. Blood painted his armor, his tabard torn, his shield splintered beyond recognition. His wounds screamed, but he felt nothing. Not pain, not relief, just emptiness. Marianne was gone. He had left her behind in the abyss. And as he stumbled into the torchlit courtyard, he saw Lord Reynard de Montfort waiting. The noble's expression was unreadable, his cold blue eyes scanning Julien's broken form. The air was still. Then Reynard spoke. "Is it done?" The words were hollow. No concern for the knight's wounds, no relief at his return. Just a simple question. Julien exhaled, his throat raw. The beast is dead. The Grey Seer is gone. The tunnels collapsed. For a moment no one spoke. Then a quiet scoff. Reynard's expression darkened. "You say the beast is dead, and yet—" He gestured around them. The castle ruins remained. The land was still cursed. The people had not returned. Julien's fingers clenched into fists. The unwanted truth. "I bled for this land. I fought for it." Julien's voice was hoarse but firm. Reynard took a slow step forward, his fine cloak trailing behind him. "And yet the people will not return. They will whisper of the horrors that lurked beneath our feet. They will say you did not slay a monster, but only woke something worse." Julien's jaw tightened. "They will say what they will, but I did my duty." Reynard's eyes narrowed. "Did you?" The word struck harder than any blade. Julien could have defended himself, could have argued, but he was too tired. And deep down, a part of him wondered if Reynard was right. A hollow victory. "The war is not yet won, Sir Julien," Reynard continued. "The land is still tainted, the people still afraid. And you?" He looked Julien over, his gaze sharp. "You are not the hero they expected." Julien felt something in his chest tighten. He had descended into hell, had fought and bled, and now they questioned him, as if he had failed. His hands shook, though whether from exhaustion or fury he did not know. For the first time, he wondered, had he truly won? Or had he simply survived? The burden of a knight. Lord Reynard turned away, his tone final. "You will have your rest," said Julien, "but do not mistake survival for victory." The words lingered, heavier than the armor on his back. Julien stood alone in the ruined courtyard, the cool night wind biting against his wounds. He had done what was right. He had fought with honor, and yet there was no glory here. No cheers of triumph, no celebration, only the cold realization that war never truly ends. And knights like him, they fought until they had nothing left. Then they fought again. Chapter 18. The Shadow Lingers. The fortress ruins were silent, too silent. Julien sat alone in the great hall, what little remained of it. A shattered table, a single flickering candle, the cold weight of his sword resting across his lap. The wounds on his body were healing. The wounds in his mind were not. A war not yet won. Lord Reynard had sent word to the neighboring fiefdoms. The beast was slain, the threat ended. But the people did not return. The land remained empty, haunted by memory and fear, and whispers spread. They always did. Julien heard them from the few retainers who remained. The Grey Seer still lives. The tunnels collapsed. But did they truly bury the evil? Or did it slip away? A knight went down there, a good man. But something else came back. Julien gritted his teeth. They spoke as if he hadn't bled for them, as if he hadn't fought until he had nothing left, as if the monster had not died by his blade. But deep down, even he wasn't certain. Did it truly die? Julien had seen the mutant fall. He had watched the light leave its twisted eyes. But chaos was never so easily defeated. It had taken a man and turned him into a beast. And Julien's fingers curled into fists. The Grey Seer had escaped. He had not seen him die. And if Skirthreich still lived, then so too did the corruption. Had he won? Or he only delayed something far worse? The doubt in their eyes. Even as he walked through the ruins, he felt their stares. The knights, the servants, those who should have seen him as a hero. But they did not look at him with admiration. They looked at him with uncertainty, some with fear. Even Reynard had spoken cautiously now, as if he wondered, had Julien truly come back whole, or had chaos left its mark? The mark of chaos. Julien had seen the signs before. Knights who fought too long in the dark. Men who returned from the wild places of the world, changed. Not outwardly, not at first, but something in their eyes, in their voice. They had fought monsters, and in doing so had become them. Had he? Julien lifted his hand to his reflection in the polished steel of his sword. His face was the same, his eyes. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw them glow. Warp-painted, he shook his head, exhaling sharply. No, he was himself. He was still a knight of Bretonnia, wasn't he? The shadow remains. Night fell over Château L'Obscur. Julien stood alone on the ramparts, staring into the blackened horizon. The battle was over. The war was not. Somewhere, Skirthreich was still out there, plotting, watching, waiting. And Julien knew one day he would return. The only question was, would Julien still be himself when that day came? Or had he already changed? Chapter 19. The Grail's Judgment. The roads to his homeland were long and empty, stretching like veins through the dying land. Julien rode alone, his armor still tarnished with the filth of the Skaven tunnels, his wounds hidden beneath the weight of his cloak. The journey had been silent. No songs of triumph, no cheers of victory. Only the cold wind and the whisper of something darker in his thoughts. The shadow of what he had seen, what he had done, and what he had failed to do. He needed clarity. He needed absolution. And so he returned to the shrine, the sacred place. The chapel of St. Eramond sat atop a lonely hill, overlooking the mist-veiled fields of his homeland. It was a place of pilgrimage, where knights who had fought long wars knelt in prayer, seeking a sign. The grail had been seen here before. It had blessed his forebears. Would it bless him? Julien dismounted, his body aching with every step as he approached the stone altar. The air was cold, but not unwelcoming. The statue of the lady stood above him, her expression serene, distant. He dropped to one knee, and he prayed, a plea for guidance. Lady of the lake, hear me. I have done what was right. I have fought with honor. But I have also failed. I have doubted. I have seen things no knight should see. Tell me, am I worthy? Have I done enough? Silence. The candles flickered. The wind howled through the chapel's stone walls. Julien waited. He had heard her voice before. Hadn't he? He had felt her light in the cavern. Hadn't he? His breath grew shallow. Had it been real? Or had it simply been his own will refusing to break? Minutes passed, then hours, and still the grail did not come. The weight of silence. Julien's fingers clenched into fists. This was a test. It had to be. He had fought. He had bled. He had given everything. And yet there was only silence. Had he been found wanting? Had he strayed too far? Was he still a knight of the lady? Or had the taint of the warren, the whispers of the Skaven, the mark of chaos? Had it changed him? His breath was unsteady now, his chest tightening. Please, his voice cracked, barely a whisper. Still nothing. Not even a whisper of divine grace. Only the cold. A night without a sign. Julien rose, his legs stiff, his mind heavy, He looked one last time at the statue of the lady. She remained unchanged, distant, untouched. He turned without another word, stepping away from the altar. The grail had not come, and he did not know if it ever would. Chapter 20. A Knight's Burden. Julien rode alone. The shrines had given him no answers. The lady had not spoken. The grail had not appeared. And yet the road stretched onward, endless and unchanged. The world had not stopped for his doubt. It had not waited for his faith to be restored. There were still battles to fight, still evils to face. And so he rode, because a knight's duty did not end. Not with victory, not with failure, not even with doubt. The wounds that never heal. His body bore the scars of his descent into the warren. Some would heal, most would not. But it was the wounds unseen that troubled him the most. The whispers still lingered in his thoughts. Skrithrik was still out there. The Grey Seer had escaped into the darkness, leaving behind only ruin and questions. Julien knew he would face him again. Perhaps not today. Perhaps not for years. But the war against the darkness never truly ended. And knights like him, they fought until there was nothing left. Then they fought again. Faith, shaken but not broken. The lady had not answered. But that did not mean she was gone. Faith was not about certainty. It was about struggle. And Julien still had strength left to fight. Perhaps, one day, he would stand before the grail. Perhaps he would never find it at all. But his duty remained. That was enough. That had to be enough. A knight rides on. The road stretched onward, winding through mist-covered fields and shadowed forests. There would be more battles, more monsters, more tests, but Sir Julien of House Calmont would meet them all. Not because he sought glory, not because he sought reward, but because he was a knight, and that was what knights did. With his sword at his side and his burden upon his back, Julien rode forth once more.